Good afternoon. As Elena said, I'm a PhD student at HSS. My research is about the history of nursing, education, practices, and political participation in Sudan from 1899 until 1970s. I will present today part of my research proposal. I will focus on the shift between the way my research was planned in the proposal and the kind of changes I have made in the methods and data during the first year of my PhD. This shift had not only to do with the research process itself, but also with the outbreak of war in Sudan in April 2023, which changed the environment of the research radically. I have just started my second year of the PhD and need to make many adjustments to the new situation. I will talk about some of the ideas I have in this direction, and I'm looking forward to your comments, critique, and suggestions. I will start by giving an overview of the topic, objectives, and questions of the study as formulated in my proposal. I will then present data sources and methods as I initially envisaged. Afterward, I will show the challenges that arose before and after the start of the war. And finally, present some ideas on how to deal with these challenges in the coming period. I will now introduce my research topic, which connects medical anthropology, sociology of work, and social history of professions. The historical study of professional work is confronted with the complications of finding material, as many everyday practices are rarely documented. This is even more the case with the women's work, which has long been neglected, and especially with the professions that have long been considered to be peripheral. In this sense, the history of nursing is an extraordinary change, most of all in a context where historiography is still limited and or very focused on limited issues, such as Sudanese historiography. The few major works on medical history that exist, for instance, have little to say about other than medical doctors and laboratory science or medical system. There are, however, important reasons to study women's labor in general and medical work in particular. The professional education and related behavior of women was not only one of the central elements of the British civilizing mission, but continues to be an important issue in both gender and labor politics after flag independence. In fact, there are not just changes, but several significant continuous one can observe in that regard. For instance, gender hierarchies in the medical field. Since both men and women were educated and worked as nurses, the details for gendering professions can be traced well. Looking closely at involved institutions such as the nursing college in Khartoum, nursing school, and midwives schools, that allows differentiated analysis of how and which students were accepted in terms of belonging, socio-economic status, and gender. This can be related to the general infrastructure, educational and development politics of the colonial, postcolonial state, example, vis-à-vis, missionary schools, and Arabization. This also implies look at the geographical distribution of medical care and the underlying rationale. An even greater level of detail can be achieved by additional biographical study of nurses. With a close consideration of everyday practices and interest in routine and small variations well established in medical sociology and anthropology, but adjusted to the possibility and limits of oral history. closer look at nursing as a professional status and social role needs to discuss pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial practices of care, including different notions of care for the sick, which is a wider meaning of Arabic term mumarrid. This concerns not only the introduction of biomedical norms of professional identity in a relation to other forms of health knowledge and practices. This also look at the hierarchies they came with: medical doctors, medical assistants, nurses, midwives. Such hierarchies pertain to salary structure and prestige. First, for instance, when nurses are paid more than midwives, or when different salaries apply to nurses from different educational institutions. Society's acceptance or suspicions, the latter often with moralizing components, varies as the nurses have not the same status in society as, for instance, medical doctors. In fact, since nursing has been long considered close to servitude or even slavery, its wider acceptance has been a long process which I will study in my work. There is a chance here to discuss questions of gender, race, belonging, and labor together. But there is also an important aspect of political participation. While there are some iconic female figures in the history of the independence movement, as well as the early parliaments, women's overall role and contribution as intellectual and activist personalities, as well as sustainers of everyday life, is strongly underrepresented in often elite historiography. A focus on nursing can contribute much to challenging this underrepresentation. Nurses, as a part of a new British educated stratum in society, form part of transformations in the way political participation was understood and undertaken. This means not only the development towards unions, where both the nurses' union and individual nurses as influential members in other unions are to be considered, like, for instance, women union. The role nurses can play and have played in politics was beyond call for reform of working conditions or other labor rights. It extended to political action toward changing the government or regime. But this historical remains merely indicated from anecdotal evidence that needs deeper study and analysis. Objectives of my study are as follows: to analyze the socio-political and economic context for the development of nursing during colonial and post-colonial times in Sudan, to contribute to the documentation of educational contents and methods, as well as nursing practices during the study period, to elaborate on colonial and post-colonial discourses about nurses, societal status pertaining to different sources of knowledge and practices, as well as their general role in society, to contribute to the documentation of political participation of nurses with a focus on, but not limited to, labor activism and formation of trade union, to elaborate on colonial and post-colonial discourses about nurses' political status pertaining to participation in professional decision-making, as well as a wider political status. Okay. On this basis, I formulated these research questions. How did political and economic developments during the study period frame and influence the provision of health services in general, and nursing in particular? What institutions were formed and or used during the study period for the professional education of nurses? Who entered them, how and why? as administrator, educator, or student. What educational materials and teaching methods were used during the study period, and how did they relate to other forms of health knowledge? Example, non-medical. How did the transition from being trained to starting work take place? Under which conditions did the nurse work where? How was their background related to where and how they were employed? What practices did nurses have during the study period, and how did they relate to other forms of medical practices, like faith healing? Nurses' status in society. What were conditions were considered critically by nurses, and which were actively addressed through political action? When and how were common labor issues of nurses turned into the formation of union? What were the exact circumstances and consequences of this formation? What issues were actively addressed by the politically active nurses and the union members? In how far did this go beyond labor issue, example, in frame of the independence movement? Last, how did the political status of nurses change during the study period? How did how others relate to their political activities, also concerning different notions of their professional identity? Method and data source as in my proposal. I plan to use the following data source and methods. The main two kinds of sources that I considered were interviews with the oldest living generation of nurses in Sudan, and archival material in the National Record Office in Sudan, addition to archives in UK, London, Durham, Birmingham. For the interviews, I wanted to focus on the generations that graduated in the 1950s and 1960s. My questions centered on why they studied nursing and how they got access to it, what educational content were, how they were employed after graduation, and what kind of work they did, what their everyday routine were, and what changed over their years of practices. I also aimed at talking with the political active nurses and family members of nurses, as well as trying to access family archives for additional documents. In addition, I intended to conduct expert interviews with the medical historiographers. In the National Records Office of Sudan, I wanted to ask records related to nursing, as well as records of most relevant institutions such as Ministry of Health, hospitals, and nursing training programs. There was also idea to take newspapers from the study period, as well as the women-centered journal like Sawt al-Mar'a. In the UK, my goal was to look for institutional records and files of medical staff, in addition to specific documents such as inspection tours to train health practitioners and handover notes that give an overview of medical situation at a specific point in time. I consider the photographic record at the Sudan Archive at Durham University also as essential source, as it provides additional evidence for women presence and labor, often not reflected in written material. Missionary records also relevant to me, as many early biomedical institutions were opened by Christian missions. In this last part of my presentation, I will indicate some of the work I have done up to now and how I plan to continue. As I have mentioned in the beginning, the war in Sudan disturbed many things for almost all Sudanese. And it has, of course, also a deep impact on my research. My approach had to adjust and is since then in a constant state of being under construction. Let me first consider the complication in the initial period. After I started the research in December 2022, I learned from my colleagues that access to the National Archive in Khartoum can be difficult unless one knows how to deal with the employers and the security agents stationed there. And I received several suggestions in that direction. On the other hand, my initial and later interviews opened a wider view on other archives, not a few of them I hadn't even considered in the beginning. This started with archives in other regions and other type of institutional archives in Khartoum, such as the Sudan Library, containing the annual reports of Minister of Health, and also an archive of the Ministry of Culture, which has videos and photos that might be relevant to my subject. The Institute of Afro-Asian Studies at Khartoum University has a depository of oral history as well as a rich library. Documents on general and professional education can be found at the Muhammad Umar Bashir Center of Ahliya University. And the Ahfad University for Women had an own documentary project on pioneer nurses. From the many suggestions I received during that time, I made a list of many researchers, book collectors, and private collections of scholars in several regions in Sudan that I can contact before my planned visit to Sudan in May 2023. Even more, up to April 2023, I had agreed with numerous families in Omdurman and elsewhere who were glad to host me and share their personal documents and memories for family members who had been nurses. Sadly, a war started in Sudan on 15 April 2023 in Khartoum, the capital city. Most of the people and institutions I have mentioned were in the capital, and now in the danger of death and destruction. The people I had contacted for the research I tried to reach now to trace their situation, many of them I couldn't even hear about as internet connection and electricity broke down, and hundreds of thousands were displaced. While coming to terms with the war situation myself, I still had to try to continue my research somehow. First, I tried to overcome being cut off of Sudan by shifting forward my visit to the archives in the UK. I spent there 2 months in July and August, and I plan to extend my search to other archives, for instance, the WHO and the ILO archives in Geneva, and the archive of the Sudanese Communist Party in Amsterdam. In Birmingham and Nottingham, I was also able to conduct 2 in-depth interviews with the Sudanese nurses who were coincidentally on a visit to their families before the war. During the interviews, both of them repeatedly what they had left behind: documents, photos, and books, among other things that had great value to them. They describe in details what was in them and which form they left them. This was something I continued to experience over the following period. What was lost became a common thread in the conversations, and whether moving forward meant to try to save as much as possible from memory or to focus on the needs of the hour. I encountered both demands, and I started, inspired by my interlocutors' experience, to document not only what I found, but also what materials related to my research could have been found and only now became missing due to the exploding violence. In August, I asked through my own social network and social media for help in identifying documents, visual materials, research, people who could contribute to the documentation of the history of nursing in Sudan. I got many reactions, informative, supportive, but also challenging, mostly, but not only, from outside Sudan. Several people dedicated part of their time to collect materials from the internet and send them by email. Researchers of Ahfad University shared with me what they recalled of missing records, documents, and their research experience with the pioneer nurses. Other names for interview partners and more stories. Other names for interview partners and more stories of missing resources continue to appear, such as records of nurses on the level of Sudan and in the level of the states in the registry of civil workers. Some interlocutors were still or becoming accessible abroad, for instance in Cairo or online. And I added people working with the nurses to my new list of interview. I conduct now interviews with the doctors and medical assistants from different generations to see what has been taught about the work of nurses and what were their later experience with the nurses or midwives. I also began interviews with a unionist who worked in the Ministry of Health to document internal conflict and mutual experience from other angle. But the circumstance that were met now under conditions of war also brought new dynamics. New dynamics into the conversations and interviews, which often were and still are difficult and tasking. I encountered several times, for instance, the suggestions or even challenge that my research should include the current situation as a history of the present, documenting the current violence against or kidnapping of medical workers seems, from the perspective of some, much more relevant. Others asked straightforwardly how my research will help Sudanese revolution or contribute to solutions for the current conflicts. This continues, in fact, a feature of previous biographical interviews that came now much stronger to the fore. The direct relation between the past and the present. Now, by extension, people ask the questions how looking at the past serve the future. Often biographical accounts carried with them already clear answer, even before I engaged in interpreting what I had heard. Interviewees would draw lines from their past and relate them to the current issues, dividing memories from interpretation colored by the radical situation. All of us found ourselves in become more challenging. At the same time, I found myself engaging with the interlocutors in private issues and emotions that we'll all face in one way or another. And long passages in our talks were devoted to speak about lost or missing family members, about dangerous escapes, about fears and worries. In this context, when to introduce or even push for my research issues become intricate questions. We share this fragile and violent situation, and establishing my research topic as a priority in the conversation was both necessarily, but made me also often question my position and the nature of this interaction. Was I becoming an extractor of knowledge rather than engaging in finding a shared interest? I often found that it was possible to reach such a point, but it took much time and emotional energy. So it remains vivid question. How to react when I find myself included in very detailed issues in the families of the interlocutors. The shape of interviews changed very much as well. It became much more difficult to have a continuous interviews. Often contact was only possible through apps such as WhatsApp and Messenger. And it is many times interrupted, sometimes for days and weeks, or interlocutors suddenly disappeared for various reasons. The resulting fragmentation demanded from me to find new ways to keep track of where my interlocutors and I had arrived at when the connection stopped. I designed an Excel sheet as a database to organize my contact and found it a very useful technique to map my materials. I can not only observe what period or aspect research enough material to start focusing on it. I can also gather the many fragmented sources on biographies from photos, Facebook pages, novels, short stories, newspaper, video, artworks, and promote new interviews by contacting the creator of these contents to inquire what resources or experience with the nurses or midwives inspired them. Later on, I will transfer the most productive material to qualitative research software for analysis. To conclude, I wanted to focus today on methodological issue that I grapple with, since they are not just about how to gain good material for my analysis, but about how I relate to the people I do research on and with. I hope for your consideration and experience in this regard, including suggestions what to read, to think more systematically through the complications I outlined. But I also appreciate very much your thoughts on relevant works on nursing history from other contexts. Thank you very much.